For centuries, the Vatican has warned us of demons, of the devil lurking in shadows. But what if their greatest fear was not Satan at all? What if it was something far older, carved into clay thousands of years before the Bible? Whispers of the Anunnaki. This is not a standalone documentary. This is part of a series, and each episode reveals something that changes everything. The Sumerian spoke of gods who shaped mankind from clay, a garden watered by sacred rivers, a woman born from a rib. These stories existed long before Genesis was written on parchment. They were too precise to ignore. Were these echoes forgotten, or were they erased? Tonight we journey through a history rarely told. If you enjoy uncovering forgotten truths, walk with us into the silent corners of the past. Together we follow the trail where clay and scripture meet. Let us begin with the world before the Bible, a world of clay. Imagine a desert where the wind carries the scent of ancient dust. Imagine a city rising from the sand, not slowly, but all at once. This was Sumer. This was the beginning of what we call civilization. But for the Vatican, Sumer was not just a historical curiosity. It was a problem. It was a voice from the deep past that threatened to dismantle the foundations of their power. In the ruins of cities like Eridu and Uar, archaeologists found more than just walls and pottery. They found the records of a world that should not have existed. They found stories of kings who ruled before the world was drowned. They found lists of names and dates that stretched back into a time where history and myth become one. The Sumerian king list is a document that still haunts the halls of academia and the vaults of the church. It is a simple list of names carved into stone and clay. It begins with a phrase that sounds like a bell ringing through time. When kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu, heaven. To a modern ear, it sounds like a religious metaphor. To a medieval priest, it sounds like the grace of God. But to the people of Sumer, it was a physical reality. Kingship did not grow from the soil. It was not a human invention. It was a gift, or perhaps a burden, brought down from the stars. The sovereigns of Sumer were not called kings because they were the strongest warriors. They were kings because they were chosen by the Anunnaki. These were the star-born sovereigns, beings who stood between the sky and the earth. The Vatican has spent 2,000 years teaching us that power comes from a single, invisible source. They taught us that kings are anointed by the hand of a silent God. But Sumer tells a different story. It speaks of a time when the gods were not silent. It speaks of a time when the source of power was visible, tangible, and terrifying. On the Sumerian king list, the first rulers are credited with reigns that defy all logic. One king ruled for 28,000 years, another for 36,000. These were the pre-flood kings, the giants of memory who lived while the world was young. For the church, these numbers are a threat. If these kings were real, then the biblical timeline is not a complete history. It is a fragment. If these kings lived for tens of thousands of years, then they were not human in the way we understand it. They were something else. They were the Anunnaki themselves, or their direct offspring. The Vatican feared the Anunnaki because their existence suggests that the divine is not a distant spirit, but a physical presence with a history of its own. In the shadows of the Vatican archives, there are reports of these tablets. Scholars who looked too closely at the numbers and were told to look elsewhere. Priests who realized that the patriarchs of the Bible, men like Methuselah who lived for hundreds of years, were only shadows of these Sumerian giants. The Bible says Adam lived 900 years. Sumer says a king ruled for 30,000. The echo is there, but the scale is different. It is as if the writers of Genesis were trying to remember a grander story, but had lost the key. Or perhaps they were trying to hide the scale of the past to make their own narrative seem more manageable. Sumer was a cradle of kings, but it was a cradle rocked by hands that did not belong to this world. The Anunnaki did not just give the Sumerians the right to rule. They gave them the tools of civilization. They gave them the me. In the ancient texts, the me were objects of power. They were physical things that could be held, stolen, and transported. They were the decrees of the gods, but they functioned like technology. There was a me for kingship, a me for writing, a me for war, a me for the weaving of cloth. To the Sumerians, civilization was not a slow climb of discovery. It was a download. It was a collection of programs handed down by the star-born sovereigns. This is what the Vatican could never allow. The idea that human knowledge did not come from a slow, divinely guided evolution of the soul, but from a direct transfer of technology from alien beings. If the Anunnaki gave us the me, then our laws, our arts, and our very structures of power are not holy. They are inherited. They are the leftovers of a much older and more complex system. In the Sumerian carvings, we see the kings standing before the Anunnaki. The kings are smaller, reaching up to the knees or waist of their masters. The Anunnaki are depicted as towering figures, often holding strange objects. Some hold buckets, some hold pine cones, some wear watches on their wrists. These are not the images of a spiritual vision. They are the portraits of a meeting. The Vatican has always preferred the image of the burning bush or the voice in the whirlwind. These are things that cannot be measured. They cannot be photographed. They belong to the realm of faith. But a 10-foot-tall being wearing a flight suit is not an object of faith. It is an object of science. It is a physical fact. In fact, are the enemies of a church built on mystery. The star-born sovereigns established a hierarchy that we still follow today. They created the city-state. They created the tax system. They created the priesthood. In Sumer, the priest was not just a man of prayer. He was a technician. He was the one who maintained the house of the god. And the house of the god was a physical building, the ziggurat, where the Anunnaki would descend to eat, sleep, and issue commands. When the Bible speaks of the Tower of Babel, it is remembering the ziggurats of Sumer. It is remembering a time when humanity tried to reach the heavens. But the Bible tells it as a story of pride and punishment. It turns a place of connection into a place of confusion. Why? Because the church needed to break the memory of that connection. They needed to make the sky a place where no one could go. They needed to make the gods into one God who was far away, unreachable, and silent. But the clay remembers the noise. The tablets tell us that the Anunnaki were loud. They argued. They feasted. They made mistakes. One of the most famous star-born sovereigns was Gilgamesh. He was 2/3 divine and 1/3 human. He was a king who sought immortality. He was a king who traveled to the end of the world to find the secret of the gods. His story was written 1,000 years before the first word of the Bible was recorded. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, we see the struggle of a man who knows he is part God, but is still bound by the earth. He seeks the plant of eternal life. He meets the survivor of the great flood. He learns that the gods are not always kind. The Vatican feared Gilgamesh because he represents the bridge between the two worlds. He is the evidence that the line between human and Anunnaki was once blurred. If humanity is part divine, not because of a soul given by a spirit, but because of a bloodline shared with the stars, then the entire structure of the church collapses. The church exists to be the bridge. If the bridge is already in our DNA, then the church is unnecessary. The sovereigns of Sumer were the original kings. Their authority was absolute because it was based on the presence of their creators. When Anunnaki eventually left or retreated into the shadows, They left behind a vacuum. The kings who followed were no longer star-born. They were just men, but they still wanted the power of the gods. And so, they began to invent the idea of the divine right of kings. They began to pretend that they were still in contact with the heavens. They began to turn the physical reality of the Anunnaki into the religion of the state. This is where the Vatican enters the story. The Church is the ultimate evolution of this process. It is the institution that took the broken echoes of Sumer and polished them into a holy narrative. It took the star-born sovereigns and turned them into angels and demons. It took the Anunnaki and hid them behind the face of a single, jealous god. But the desert does not keep secrets forever. When the sand blew away from the mounds of Mesopotamia in the 19th century, the silence of the Vatican was broken. The clay began to speak. It spoke of Eridu. It spoke of the king list. It spoke of the star-born ones who shaped the cradle of our world. We are told that we are the masters of our own history. We are told that we rose from the mud by our own strength. But the tablets of Sumer suggest that we were directed. We were governed. We were part of a sovereign plan that was established long before the first prayer was whispered in Rome. The cradle of kings was not a place of human triumph. It was a place of divine engineering. And as we look closer at these star-born sovereigns, we begin to see the patterns that the Vatican tried to erase. We see the numbers that don't add up. We see the technologies that shouldn't exist. We see a past that is far more crowded and far more complex than the Bible allows. Tonight, we follow the trail of those kings. We look past the sermons and the stained glass. We look into the deep silence of the clay. For in the ruins of Sumer, the gods are not gone. They are waiting to be remembered. They are waiting for us to realize that our history did not begin in a garden. It began in a laboratory. It began in a council chamber. It began when the stars decided to reach down and touch the earth. The Vatican has always known this. They have always feared the day when we would stop looking at the sky with faith and start looking at it with memory. Because once you remember the star-born sovereigns, the world of the Church becomes very small. The stone walls of the Vatican seem thin. The authority of the Pope seems like a whisper compared to the thunder of the Anunnaki. And so, we walk further into cradle. We listen to the names of the kings who ruled for thousands of years. We ask who they really were and why they left. And we ask what they left behind in us. For the sovereigns of Sumer were not just our rulers. They were our architects. And the house they built is still standing. Even if we have forgotten the names of the builders, the story of the Anunnaki is the story of our origins. It is a story written in clay and blood. And it is a story that the Vatican can no longer keep in the shadows. Let us look now at the forbidden bloodlines. Let us look at the ones who were born of the stars and the earth. Let us look at the sovereigns who were lost but are now found. The cradle is empty, but the kings are still here, hiding in the echoes of our laws, our buildings, and our dreams. And as we move from the ruins of Sumer into the midst of the Bible, we see the bridge that was built to hide the truth. We see how the star-born were turned into the fallen. We see how the truth was edited to keep us in the dark. But the clay remembers. The stars remember. And tonight we remember too. The sand of a rock holds secrets that parchment could never contain. For nearly 2,000 years, the world believed that the story of creation began with the first breath of Genesis. We were told that the words given to Moses were the first words, the only words delivered from a singular height. But in the mid-19th century, the earth began to give up a different memory. When archaeologists brushed away the dust of millennia in the ruins of Nineveh, they did not find scrolls. They found clay, hard, burnt fragment of the earth covered in wedge-shaped marks. This was the royal library of Ashurbanipal, a king who ruled long before the rise of Rome or the compilation of the New Testament. Among the 20,000 tablets recovered, one set of stories sent a shockwave through the halls of the Vatican and the universities of Europe. These were the accounts of the Anunnaki, the ones who from heaven to earth came. They spoke of a time when gods walked the earth, when the stars were mapped, and when humanity was crafted in a way that sounded hauntingly familiar. Yet these tablets were carved at least 1,000 years before the first Hebrew scribe dipped a pen in ink. The Vatican has long guarded the narrative that the Bible is a unique revelation, a voice speaking into a void. But the clay tells a different story. It suggests that the Bible was not the beginning, but a carefully filtered reflection of something far older. To understand the fear that these tablets inspired, we must look at the Enuma Elish. Known as the 7 tablets of creation, this Mesopotamian epic describes the birth of the cosmos. It tells of a time when chaos reigned, represented by the dragon Tiamat. The god Marduk battles this chaos, separating the waters, fixing the stars in their paths, and establishing the order of the world. Across 7 tablets, the work is completed and the gods rest. Now, listen to the rhythm of Genesis. 7 days of creation, the separation of the waters from the waters, the fixing of the sun, moon, and stars to govern the seasons. The parallels are not vague. They are structural. The sequence of events is nearly identical, but there is a profound change in the telling. In the Sumerian version, creation is a violent struggle, a war of gods and cosmic forces. In Genesis, it is a calm command. The Hebrew scribes took the bones of the older story and covered them in a new skin of monotheism. They removed the many voices of the Anunnaki and replaced them with the singular voice of the Creator. This was an act of editing. It was a strategy to simplify the divine, to move away from a council of gods and toward a single authority. For the Vatican, the existence of the Enuma Elish is a reminder that their foundation is built upon a retelling. If the first story was written in clay by people who worship the Anunnaki, then where does the revelation truly begin? The similarities grow even more intimate when we look at the shaping of mankind. Genesis tells us that God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils a breath of life. In the Sumerian myths, the god Enki and the goddess Ninmah also shaped humanity from the clay of the earth. But the reason for this creation is where the stories diverge. In the Bible, man is the crown of creation, made for a relationship with the divine. In the older tablets, the Anunnaki created humanity because they were tired of working. The lesser gods had grown weary of digging canals and tilling the soil. They demanded a worker, someone to carry the basket. Humanity was engineered as a labor force. This is a truth that the Vatican could never allow to stand. To admit that our origins might be tied to a need for labor rather than a desire for love would shatter the theological glass. The Church teaches that we are born of grace, but the clay whispers that we were born of necessity. This memory of being molded from earth is so deep that even the Hebrew scribes could not erase it. They kept the dust, they kept the clay, but they changed the purpose. They turned a servant into a child of God. We see the same pattern in the story of the first woman. In Genesis, Eve is formed from the rib of Adam. For centuries, this has been seen as a beautiful symbol of companionship, but scholars have found a linguistic bridge in the Sumerian language. The Sumerian word for rib is ti, which also means to make alive. In the myth of Enki and Ninhursag, a goddess named Ninti is created to heal Enki's rib. Her name literally means the lady of the rib and the lady who makes alive. It is a play on words, a pun that makes perfect sense in Sumerian, but is lost in the translation into Hebrew. When the story was retold in Genesis, the pun was gone, but the rib remained. This tells us that the writers of the Bible were working with older material, perhaps material they did not fully understand or chose to reshape for their own ends. The Vatican's fear is rooted in these details. Every time a tablet is translated, it reveals another stitch in the fabric of the Bible that leads back to the Anunnaki. It suggests that the Holy Word is a tapestry of older threads rewoven to hide the original weavers. If you are fascinated by these hidden connections between the ancient world and the stories we've been told, I encourage you to subscribe to this channel. We are exploring the silent corners of history together, uncovering the truths that were meant to remain buried. Your support helps us continue this journey into the depths of the past. Let us move forward into the garden itself. The Garden of Eden is perhaps the most famous paradise in human memory, a place of 4 rivers, of fruit trees, and of eternal life. But long before the Bible was written, the Sumerians spoke of Dilmun. Dilmun was a land of purity where the sun rises, a place where sickness and death did not exist. It was a dwelling place of gods, a garden where the rivers flowed sweet. The descriptions of Dilmun and Eden are so similar that many scholars believe Dilmun was the original inspiration. But there is a dark shadow in the Sumerian garden that the Bible transformed. In the older stories, the gods are often at odds. There is debate, there is conflict, and there is a sense that paradise is a place of the divine alone. In Genesis, paradise is a gift given to man and then taken away. The fall of man is a central pillar of Christian doctrine. It is the reason for the cross and the reason for the church's existence. But if the garden was originally a Sumerian myth about the dwelling of the Anunnaki, then the concept of original sin changes entirely. The fall becomes not a moral failure of humanity, but a separation between the created workforce and their creators. This leads us to the most controversial figure in the garden, the serpent. In the Bible, the serpent is a deceiver, the bringer of sin and death. He is the enemy of God. But in the ancient Near East, the serpent was a symbol of wisdom, healing, and life. It was associated with the god Enki, the very one who shaped humanity and often stood as their protector against the more temperamental gods. In the Sumerian view, the serpent would not be a tempter leading man to ruin, but a teacher offering man the knowledge of his own nature. When the Vatican looks at these tablets, they see a reversal of their entire moral order. If the serpent was originally a messenger of wisdom from a god who cared for humanity, then the story of the fall is actually a story of humanity being denied knowledge. The church transformed the symbol of enlightenment into a symbol of evil to ensure obedience. They took the ancient wisdom of the Anunnaki and branded it as the whisper of the devil. This is why the Vatican feared the tablets. They don't just offer a different history. They offer a different identity. The memory of a great flood is written into the bedrock of almost every ancient culture, but nowhere is it more precise than in the tablets of the Atrahasis and the Epic of Gilgamesh. These texts describe a god who decides to wipe out humanity because their noise is keeping him awake. Another god, Enki, warns a man to build a boat, to save his family, and to preserve the seeds of life. The man sends out birds, a dove, a swallow, and a raven to find land. When the waters recede, he offers a sacrifice, and the gods gather like flies around the smoke because they were hungry without humans to feed them. This is Noah's story, detail for detail, written centuries before the book of Genesis. The ark, the animals, the birds, the altar, it is all there. But the God of the Bible is said to have sent the flood because of human sin, not because of noise. The Hebrew scribes moralize the disaster. They turn a capricious act of many gods into a righteous judgment by one God. They kept the memory of the water, but changed the reason for the rain. For the Vatican, This overlap is a dangerous proof of cultural inheritance. It suggests that the most dramatic miracle in the Bible is a retelling of a Sumerian history where the Anunnaki were the ones who controlled the tides. Even the language of the Bible hides the plural nature of the past. In the earliest Hebrew text of Genesis, the word used for God is Elohim. This is a plural noun. When the text says, "Let us make man in our image," it is a lingering echo of the Sumerian Council of the Gods. The Anunnaki did not act alone. They debated in a divine assembly. They had a hierarchy and a government. The Bible tried to smooth this over, to create the image of a single, solitary ruler of the universe. But the plural remains a crack in the monotheistic wall. The Vatican has spent centuries explaining away these plurals as a royal we or a reference to angels. But the clay tablets give a much simpler answer. The writers of the Bible were remembering a time when there was more than one voice in heaven. They were remembering the Anunnaki. The fear of the Vatican is not a fear of myths. It is a fear of the original. They know that if the world looks too closely at the clay, the uniqueness of the scroll begins to fade. They know that the power of the church rests on being the sole source of the truth. But truth is not a single path. It is a river fed by many streams. The Anunnaki are part of that river. Their stories were carved in clay to endure, to wait for a time when humanity was ready to look past the editing and see the fragments of the first memory. The Vatican may have tried to silence the clay with sermons and stone walls, but the earth does not forget. The voices of the Anunnaki still whisper from the ruins, reminding us that our story is older, deeper, and more mysterious than any single book could ever contain. As we move into the shadows of the next segment, we will see how these ancient gods did not just leave behind stories, but a legacy of power that still shapes our world today. We will look at the kings, the laws, and the hidden structures that the Vatican still fights to control. The clay is speaking. It is time we listen to the echo. In the shadows of the Holy Land, a different kind of history was buried, not one of simple faith, but one of bone and blood. For centuries, the Vatican has pointed our eyes toward the heavens, teaching us of spirits and invisible wars. But the old world tells a story that is far more solid, far more terrifying. It is a story of giants who walked the earth. It is the story of the Nephilim. To understand why the Vatican feared the Anunnaki, we must look at the moments where the Bible seems to stutter. There are verses in the book of Genesis that feel out of place. They are brief, dark, and heavy with a memory the church would rather we forget. Genesis chapter 6 tells us that when men began to multiply on the earth, the sons of God saw the daughters of men and found them beautiful. They took wives for themselves, and from this union a new race was born, the Nephilim, the fallen ones. In most sermons, these verses are passed over quickly. They are treated as metaphors or strange footnotes in a much larger story. But to the people of the ancient world, there was nothing metaphorical about them. The Nephilim were described as the heroes of old, men of renown. They were giants. They were the physical proof that the divine and the human had crossed a boundary that was never meant to be broken. If you look closely at the language, the echoes of the Anunnaki begin to scream. The Sumerians spoke of the Anunnaki as those who from heaven to earth came down. They were the biological creators, the engineers of humanity. The Bible uses a different name, the sons of God, but the action is the same. Beings of immense power descending from the sky to mingle their essence with the dust of the earth. The Vatican has spent nearly 2,000 years trying to turn these beings into ghosts. They want us to believe that the war for our souls is purely spiritual. But the clay tablets of Mesopotamia and the forbidden scrolls of the Dead Sea tell us something else. They tell us that the fear was not of spirits, but of a rival bloodline. Imagine a world where the gods did not stay in the clouds. Imagine they lived among us, building cities, demanding tribute, and fathering children who grew to towering heights. This is the world the book of Enoch describes. Enoch was the great-grandfather of Noah, and his writings were once considered sacred. But the Vatican removed the book of Enoch from the Bible. They cast it into the shadows of the Apocrypha. They did this because Enoch tells the story too clearly. Enoch speaks of 200 angels called the Watchers. They descended upon the peak of Mount Hermon, a place that still stands today on the border of Israel and Lebanon. They did not come to bring a message of peace. They came with a hunger for the earth. They swore an oath to one another to take wives and to teach humanity the secrets of heaven. They taught the art of metalworking. They taught the secrets of the stars. They taught the science of war and the making of jewelry. These were the same gifts the Anunnaki were said to have given to the Sumerians. The arts of civilization were not discovered by man. They were handed down by these outsiders. But these gifts came at a price. The children born to the Watchers, the Nephilim, were not like us. They were massive in stature and consumed the resources of the earth. They were a hunger that could not be satisfied. The ancient texts say they turned against humanity, and the earth began to groan under their weight. The Vatican feared this story because it changes the nature of God. If the sons of God could rebel, and if they could create biological life that rivaled the creation of the Father, then the authority of the Church was at risk. The existence of the Nephilim suggested that there were other players in the cosmic game. It suggested that our DNA was a battlefield. When we place the Nephilim beside the Anunnaki, the mask of the fallen angel begins to slip. We see instead a physical race of beings with advanced knowledge. We see the masters of the ancient world. The giants were not just tall men. They were the manifestation of a different kind of power. They were the biological evidence of the Anunnaki presence on Earth. For centuries, reports of giant skeletons have surfaced in the deserts of the Middle East, in the mounds of North America, and in the caves of the Mediterranean. And for centuries, these finds have vanished. There are whispers of the Smithsonian Institution and the Vatican working together to ensure that these bones never reach the public eye. Why? Because a giant femur or a double row of teeth would prove that the stories were true. It would prove that the Bible was not just a book of parables, but a history of a world shared with another race. The Vatican's greatest weapon has always been the narrative. They have defined what is holy and what is demonic. By labeling the Nephilim as a result of sin, they made it impossible to see them as anything else. But the older traditions of the East did not see them as demons. They saw them as the offspring of the gods. They were the demigods of myth, the Hercules and the Gilgamesh. They were the bridge between the stars and the soil. This bridge is what the Church needed to burn. They needed a clean separation between the human and the divine. They needed us to look only to one God and one Church for our salvation. The existence of a third race, a hybrid race, complicated the simple story of the garden and the fall. It meant that the flood was not just a punishment for human sin. It was a tactical strike. It was an attempt to wipe out a tainted bloodline. The Sumerian texts tell us that the flood was sent because the gods were tired of the noise and the rebellion of mankind. But the book of Enoch says the flood was necessary to cleanse the earth of the giants and the corruption brought by the Watchers. If you read between the lines, the flood was a biological reset. It was a way to erase the physical evidence of the Anunnaki experiment. But the story tells us that the giants survived. Genesis says there were Nephilim on the earth in those days, and also after that. This small phrase, and also after that, is one of the most haunting lines in Scripture. It means the flood did not finish the job. The giants returned. We see them again in the time of Moses and Joshua. We see the Anakim, the Rephaim, and the giants of Gath. We see David standing before Goliath. To the modern reader, Goliath is a tall man with a spear. To the ancient Israelite, he was a remnant. He was a shadow of the old world. He was a descendant of the beings who had once ruled the earth before the flood. When David struck him down, it was more than a battle between two nations. It was a new world finally extinguishing the last flickers of the old. The Vatican has kept these stories locked in a realm of Sunday school fables because the alternative is too disruptive. If we admit that giants were real, we must admit that the Watchers were real. And if we admit the Watchers were real, we must ask where they came from and where they went. We must ask if they are truly gone, or if they simply changed their form. The clay of Sumer and the scrolls of the desert tell us that the Anunnaki were obsessed with lineage. They tracked their bloodlines with precision that borders on the scientific. The Vatican, too, is obsessed with lineage. The apostolic succession, the holy blood, the chosen people. This is not a coincidence. It is a continuation of the same struggle for control over the human story. The fear of the Nephilim is the fear of a return. Throughout history, there have been movements to find the lost knowledge of the giants. The alchemists, the secret societies, and the explorers of the occult were all looking for the same thing. They were looking for the forbidden wisdom of the Watchers. They wanted the metalworking, the star charts, and the power that was taken away when the flood rose. The church stood as a gatekeeper, warning that this knowledge was cursed. They called it witchcraft. They called it heresy. But perhaps they only called it evil because it did not belong to them. It belonged to an older master. It belonged to the Anunnaki. As we walk through the ruins of the Holy Land, we find stones that are too large for any human hand to have moved. We find the foundations of Baalbek in Lebanon, where blocks weighing 1,000 tons were lifted into place. We find the megalithic structures of the Golan Heights. The church tells us these were built by forgotten civilizations using primitive tools. But the locals, the people who have lived there for millennia, have always called them the work of the giants. They remember what the Vatican tried to erase. They remember that the land was once a playground for beings who could move the earth. These were the children of the Anunnaki, the Nephilim shadows that still stretch across the history of the world. We are taught that the Bible is the beginning of our understanding of the divine. But the Nephilim remind us that the Bible is a filtered memory. It is a story that has been trimmed to fit inside the walls of the Vatican. The parts that were too strange, too physical, and too ancient were cut away. But they were not destroyed. They were only hidden. The giants are not just characters in a book. They are a warning. They are a reminder that the gods of the ancient world were not distant ideas. They were presences. They left their mark in our architecture, in our legends, and perhaps in our very bones. The Vatican has guarded the secret of the Nephilim because it is the secret of our own origins. It is the secret that we are not the only ones who have called this planet home. The shadow of the giant still looms over the pulpit. It is a shadow that stretches back to the first cities of Sumer and forward into the mysteries of the future. The church can silence the books and they can bury the bones, but they cannot stop the echo. The bloodline of the fallen ones is a thread that runs through the entire tapestry of human history. To see why the Vatican feared the Anunnaki, we must stop looking at the clouds and start looking at the ground. We must look at the stones that refuse to move and the stories that refuse to die. We must look at the giants who were erased from the holy books but remained in the memory of the earth. The Nephilim were the children of a union between the stars and the soil. They were the physical proof that we were never alone. And as we continue this journey, we find that the giants were only one part of the mystery. The true terror was not just their height, but the knowledge they brought with them. the secrets that were meant to remain hidden. The Vatican has spent centuries guarding the keys to the kingdom, but there are other keys made of clay, keys that unlock a history where the gods were kings and the kings were giants. The Nephilim shadow is long, and it covers more than just the Holy Land. It covers the very foundation of our faith. And so we must look deeper. We must follow the trail of the forbidden wisdom. We must ask what was so dangerous about the teachings of the Watchers that the world had to be drowned to stop them. We must ask if the Vatican is protecting us from the demons, or if they are protecting the narrative from the truth. The giants are gone, but their shadow remains. It is the shadow of a history that refuses to stay buried. It is the shadow of the Anunnaki walking to the pages of the Bible, hidden under the name of the fallen ones. It is time we step into that shadow and see what lies within. But before we reach the end of the trail, we must understand the power of the blood. We must understand why the lineage of the gods was the most precious thing in the ancient world. We must look at the kings who claim to be gods and the church that claimed to speak for the only one. The story of the giants is only the beginning of the Vatican's fear. For what the giants started, the kings continued. And what the kings knew, the Vatican had to hide. We turn now to the bloodlines and the struggle for the throne of the world. Beneath the heavy stone of the Vatican, far below the feet of pilgrims and the songs of the choir, lies a world of silence. It is a world of endless corridors of temperature-controlled air and of shelving that stretches for more than 50 miles. This is the Archivio Apostolico Vaticano, the secret archives. For centuries, the name itself has inspired whispers of conspiracy and hidden history. To the Church, it is simply a private library of records. But to those who follow the trail of the Anunnaki, it is a fortress built around a memory. It is a place where the echoes of clay were sent to die. Imagine the weight of all those pages. Hundreds of thousands of documents, from papal bulls to the trial records of knights and heretics. It is a monument to the power of the written word. But it is also a monument to what was excluded. When we ask why the Vatican feared the Anunnaki, we must first look at what they chose to lock away. For the Church, the story of humanity had to remain unique. It had to begin in a garden with one God and one pair of ancestors. This was the foundation of their authority. But in the middle of the 19th century, the sand of the desert began to speak. When the Royal Library of Nineveh was uncovered, thousands of clay tablets were shipped back to Europe. These tablets told of gods who descended from the heavens. They told of the Anunnaki, the ones who came from above to shape the world. The scholars who first translated these wedges were stunned. They found a flood story that matched Noah. They found a creation story that matched Genesis. And they found these stories were thousands of years older than the Bible. This was not just a curiosity. It was a crisis of origin. If the Bible was a retelling of Sumerian clay, then the Church was no longer the author of the soul. They were merely the editors of an older tale. The fear was not of demons, but of a loss of exclusivity. The Vatican has always understood that knowledge is the ultimate form of power. To control the narrative is to control the people. When these ancient tablets began to reveal a complex hierarchy of gods and a different version of human creation, the Church did not react with curiosity. They reacted with caution. They began to collect. They began to index. And they began to restrict. The secret archives became a repository for more than just diplomatic letters. It became a graveyard for inconvenient truths. Scholars have long whispered that within those vaults lie specific translations and fragments of Sumerian texts that were never released to the public. These are the texts that describe the Anunnaki not as myths, but as a physical presence. We must ask ourselves what would happen if a document was found that proved the biblical God was a local adaptation of a Sumerian deity. What would happen if the Garden of Eden was shown to be a laboratory rather than a paradise of innocence? The entire structure of Western faith would tremble. This is why the archives are so heavily guarded. It is not that they are empty, it is that they are too full. They contain the history of how the church filtered the past to create a holy present. For every scroll that reached the pulpit, another 10 were likely left in the dark. The Vatican did not just preserve the Bible, they defined it by what they removed. And what was removed most often were the traces of the ones who came before. The concept of the Watchers is a perfect example of this editing. In ancient Sumerian and Akkadian texts, there were beings called the Apkallu. These were sages who brought wisdom to mankind. They were teachers. But in the texts that the church suppressed, like the Book of Enoch, these figures became the Watchers. They were angels who fell from grace because they shared secret knowledge with humans. The church branded this knowledge as forbidden. They turned the teachers into rebels and the wisdom into sin. Why? Because a humanity that has its own source of knowledge is a humanity that does not need a priesthood. By locking away the stories of the Watchers and their connection to the Anunnaki, the Vatican ensured that they will remain the sole gatekeepers of truth. The archives also hold the records of the Index Librorum Prohibitorum, the index of prohibited books. For hundreds of years, the church maintained a list of writings that were forbidden to be read under the threat of excommunication. While many of these were works of science or philosophy, many others were early translations of Eastern myths and apocryphal gospels. These were books that spoke of a plurality of gods. They spoke of the divine as a council rather than a single angry judge. They echoed the Sumerian tradition, where the Anunnaki debated the fate of man. The church understood that if the people saw the divine as a council that could argue and make mistakes, the idea of an infallible pope would lose its meaning. To maintain the image of the perfect one, they had to erase the memory of the many. There is a rhythm to this silence. It is the rhythm of a fortress. When you walk through the archives of history, you realize that the most important stories are often the ones with the fewest surviving copies. The clay of Mesopotamia was durable. It survived for 5,000 years under sand. But the parchment of the church is fragile. It requires constant care, constant protection, and constant secrecy. The Vatican feared the Anunnaki because the Anunnaki represented history that did not need the church to exist. The tablets were there before the first priest was ever ordained. They will be there after the last cathedral has crumbled. That is a terrifying thought for an institution that claims to be eternal. But why the specific fear of the Anunnaki? Why not just treat them as dead myths like the gods of Greece or Rome? The answer lies in the precision of the Sumerian records. The Greeks told stories of gods on a mountain. The Romans told stories of gods in the sky. But the Sumerians told stories of gods who built cities, who engineered crops, and who tracked the stars with mathematical accuracy. These were not just stories of faith. They were records of a physical reality. The Vatican has always been a center of science as much as religion. They have their own astronomers. They have their own scholars. They know that the Sumerian maps of the solar system were impossibly accurate for their time. They know that the Sumerian descriptions of genetic engineering and the shaping of man are hauntingly close to modern biology. This knowledge creates a bridge that the church cannot allow the public to cross. If the Anunnaki were real, then the biblical narrative of creation is a simplified metaphor for a much more complex and perhaps more technological event. This would mean that the creators of humanity were not a distant perfect spirit, but a group of beings with their own agendas, their own conflicts, and their own flaws. It would mean that we are not the children of a miracle, but the descendants of a struggle. This is a secret that stays locked behind the heavy doors of the archives. It is a secret that humanity was not born in a state of grace, but was shaped in a state of service. We must also consider the gold. The Sumerian texts are obsessed with the mining of gold. They claim the Anunnaki came to Earth specifically to extract this metal for their own atmosphere. In the Bible, gold is always associated with the divine. The Ark of the Covenant was plated in it. The Temple of Solomon was filled with it. The Vatican itself is decorated with more gold than almost any other place on Earth. Is this just a symbol of wealth? Or is it a lingering echo of a very old requirement? In the archives, there are records of the Crusades, of the conquest of the Americas, and of the systematic collection of the world's treasures. The Church has always been obsessed with the metals of the earth. Perhaps they know something about why that gold was originally gathered. Perhaps they are continuing a task that began long before the birth of Christ. Every time a new scroll is found in a desert cave, the world holds its breath. But the Vatican often reaches those scrolls first. They have the resources, they have the experts, and they have the motivation to ensure that whatever is found fits within the established story. When the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, it took decades for them to be fully released. Even then, there were fragments that remained hidden. These fragments often contain the most radical ideas. They talk about the war between the sons of light and the sons of darkness. They talk about beings who live for 1,000 years. They talk about a cosmic conflict that sounds more like a battle between the Anunnaki than a simple moral lesson. By controlling the release of this information, the Vatican manages the slow decay of the old myths, ensuring they never fully challenge the new ones. The archives are not just a place for the dead. They are a place for the living to stay in power. By keeping the clay and the scrolls separate, the Church keeps the people from seeing the pattern. They want us to see the Bible as a lone star in the sky. They do not want us to see it as a single point in a vast constellation of memory. When we read of the giants in Genesis, we are told to view them as a mystery. But if we read the Sumerian tablets, the mystery is solved. The giants were the offspring of the Anunnaki and human women. By keeping the solution locked in the vaults, the Church keeps the mystery alive. And as long as there is mystery, there is a need for faith. And as long as there is a need for faith, there is a need for the Vatican. But truth is like water. It finds the cracks in the stone. No matter how many miles of shelving they build, no matter how many locks they put on the doors, the voice of the clay still speaks. It speaks through the whistleblowers. It speaks through the independent archaeologists who refuse to be silenced. And it speaks through the people who are beginning to ask the right questions. We are living in an age where the secret is becoming harder to keep. The digital world has made it possible to share translations instantly. The shadows of the archives are being chased away by the light of global inquiry. The fear that the Vatican felt in the 19th century has only grown in the 21st. Because now, the people are not just reading the Bible, they are reading the clay. As we stand at the threshold of these vaults, we realize that the greatest secret is not a specific document or a hidden artifact. The greatest secret is that we have been told an edited version of our own identity. We were told we were created for love, while the clay says we were created for labor. We were told we were unique, while the clay says we were part of a larger family. We were told our history began 6,000 years ago, while the clay says it's been running for hundreds of thousands. This is the truth that the Vatican cannot allow to become common knowledge. It would not just end the Church. It would end the world as we have been taught to see it. So we leave the silence of the vaults and return to the light of the sun. But we do not return the same. We carry with us a realization that the silence of the archives is a testament to the power of the Anunnaki. You do not hide something that is irrelevant. You do not lock away a myth that has no teeth. You only build a fortress when you are afraid of what is outside the walls. The Vatican is still afraid. They are afraid of the day the clay speaks louder than the sermon. They are afraid of the day humanity looks at the stars and remembers its parents. And they are afraid of the day the secret is finally, truly out. In the next part of our journey, we will look beyond the vaults and into the veins. We will see how these ancient stories were not just written on clay and stone, but were perhaps written into our very blood. The struggle for the throne did not end in Mesopotamia. It continued through the lineages that shaped the empires of the world. From the vaults of the Vatican to the crowns of kings, the trail of the Anunnaki is hidden in plain sight. Let us move now from the silence of the library to the noise of the battlefield. We turn now to the bloodlines and the struggle for the throne of the world. For centuries, the Vatican has stood as the guardian of a single story, a story of one God, one beginning, and one path to the divine. But to build a monument of faith, one must first clear the ground. You must decide which stones to keep and which ones to cast away. In the early centuries of the Church, this was not just a spiritual task. It was a systematic purge. What we call the Bible today is a result of centuries of filtering, choosing, and erasing. And at the heart of what was removed lay the shadow of the Anunnaki. Imagine the year 325, the city of Nicaea, a gathering of bishops and leaders under the watchful eye of the Emperor Constantine. They did not come together only to pray. They came together to decide what was true and what was forbidden. Before this moment, there was no single Bible. There were hundreds of scrolls, dozens of gospels, and thousands of years of oral tradition. Some spoke of a distant, singular creator. Others spoke of beings who descended from the stars, of watchers who taught mankind the secrets of the earth, and of gods who walked among us as kings. The council had a mission. To unify an empire, you must first unify its narrative. A divided people cannot be ruled by a divided history. And so, the pruning began. The Vatican realized that the stories of the Anunnaki were a threat. If mankind believed that our creators were flesh and blood beings from another world, the authority of the Church would crumble. If the gods were simply advanced travelers who shaped us for their own ends, then the priesthood was no longer the bridge to the eternal. The Church needed a God who was untouchable, invisible, and singular. They needed a creator who did not leave behind clay tablets and technological ruins. And so, the voices of the past were silenced. For every scroll chosen for the New Testament, dozens were branded as heresy. The books that spoke too clearly of the old gods were cast into the fire or buried in the sand. This was the first great erasure. It was the moment when the alien narrative was rebranded as demonic. The Anunnaki did not disappear from the records. They were simply given new names. They became the fallen angels. They became the demons lurking in the shadows. They became the forbidden memory of a world before the Church. The scribes of Rome were masters of the edit. They took the ancient myths of Sumer and Babylon and carefully trimmed away the details that did not fit the new vision. In the old tablets, the gods fought, they made mistakes, and they looked upon humanity as a labor force. In the new scriptures, these complexities were smoothed over. The plurality of the divine council was condensed into the singular majesty of one God. But the echoes could not be fully removed. The plural language remained in the early pages of Genesis, a ghost of the assembly that once ruled the world. We must ask ourselves why the Church was so afraid of these alternatives. Why was it not enough to simply teach their own truth? Why did they have to destroy the competition? The answer lies in the nature of power. To control a person, you must control their origin story. If you can make a man forget where he came from, you can tell him who he is meant to be. The Vatican knew that the Anunnaki narrative offered a different kind of sovereignty. It suggested that humanity was not just a creation, but an experiment. It suggested that our potential was not granted by grace, but built into our very nature by those who came before. For the Vatican, this was the ultimate rebellion. To claim that man had a physical connection to the stars was to bypass the church entirely. And so, the councils worked with cold precision. They excluded the book of Enoch, which spoke of the Watchers and their earthly children. They suppressed the Gnostic Gospels, which taught that the world was created by a lesser being, a shadow of the true divine. These texts were not just different interpretations. They were reminders of the older world, the world of clay and sky gods. The silence that followed these councils was not accidental. It was a manufactured piece. For over 1,000 years, the world was told that the Bible was the only word. The tablets of Mesopotamia were buried under the dust of forgotten cities. The libraries of the East were burned or hidden. The Vatican became the sole curator of human memory. They held the keys to the past and the map to the future. But the earth has a way of holding on to its secrets. No matter how many scrolls are burned, the clay remains. In the mid-20th century, a discovery was made in the desert of Egypt, the Nag Hammadi Library. Hidden in a jar for nearly 2,000 years, these texts were the voices of those who lost a battle at the councils. They spoke of a different creation. They spoke of the archons, beings who ruled the material world and kept humanity in a state of spiritual sleep. To many, these descriptions of the archons sound hauntingly like the Anunnaki of the Sumerian tablets. They were rulers from above who manipulated the human race. The discovery of these forbidden books sent shockwaves through the halls of history. It proved that the version of Christianity we were given was not the only one. It was simply the one that survived the purge. The Vatican had spent centuries telling us that the Anunnaki and their kind were myths or devils. But these hidden scrolls told a story of a struggle for human consciousness. They suggested that the erasure of the old narrative was the greatest deception ever practiced on mankind. To understand the Vatican's fear, we must look at what was gained by the erasure. By removing the alien element from our history, the Church created a vacuum that only they could fill. They replaced a history of interaction with a history of intervention. Instead of gods who could be seen and heard, we were given a God who required total faith and total obedience to his representatives on earth. The Anunnaki were unpredictable and tangible. The Church needed a God who was predictable and silent. This was the core of the strategy. If the gods are gone, the Church is in charge. If the gods are still here, or they left behind their blueprints, then the Church is just a bystander. The councils were about removing the middleman. They wanted to make sure that no one could claim authority by pointing to the stars. They wanted all eyes turned toward the altar in Rome. But the ink of the scribes cannot cover the truth forever. As we uncover the tablets of Nineveh and the scrolls of the desert, the edited narrative begins to fray. We see the seams where the stories were stitched together. We see the gaps where the names of the old gods were scratched out. The Vatican feared the Anunnaki because the Anunnaki represent a history that does not need a church. They represent a truth that is written in our blood and in the ruins of the ancient world. The councils were not the end of the story. They were the beginning of a long silence, a silence that is only now being broken. We are living in an era where the erased narrative is returning. People are no longer satisfied with the filtered version of the past. They are looking beyond the sermons and the stained glass. They are looking back to the clay. They are looking to the stars. The church's greatest fear was never the devil. The devil is part of their system. He is the villain who makes the hero necessary. No, their greatest fear was that we would realize the hero and the villain were both parts of a much older, much more complex story. A story where the Anunnaki were not evil, but simply advanced. Where humanity was not sinful, but simply developing. Where the divine was not a mystery to be guarded by priests, but a legacy to be reclaimed by all. This is why the erasure was so thorough. It was a battle for the human soul, fought with the weapons of ink and parchment. The councils did not just decide what was holy. They decided what was real. And for nearly 2 millennia, we have lived in a reality they constructed, but the foundation is cracking. The hidden books are being read. The ancient tablets are being translated. The alien narrative is no longer a whisper in the dark. It is a voice that is growing louder every day. We are now stepping into the light of a forgotten sun. We are realizing that the silence of the church was not the absence of story, but the suppression of one. The Anunnaki were never gone. They were just waiting for us to remember how to read the world without the filters of Rome. They were waiting for us to look at the garden, the flood, and the stars with our own eyes. As we move forward, we must be willing to look at the pieces that were thrown away. We must be willing to ask why the book of Enoch was too dangerous for our eyes. We must be willing to wonder what else lies in the secret archives, locked away in the dark. Because the truth of our origin is not a single thread. It is a tapestry of many voices, many creators, and many worlds. The Vatican may have tried to trim the edges, but the tapestry is too large for any council to contain. In the next part of our journey, we will look at the physical evidence that remained despite the erasure, the monuments, the bloodlines, and the hidden technologies that the scribes could not hide. The paper may have been burned, but the stone still stands. And the stone tells a story that the councils could never silence. If you are moved by the search for these lost truths, I invite you to subscribe and stay with us. Your curiosity is the key that unlocks these ancient gates. Together, we are walking back through the halls of history, past the censors and the silencers, to the very beginning, to the world of the Anunnaki, to the truth that was erased, but never forgotten. The silence is ending. The story is being reclaimed. And the power that was once held by the few is returning to the many. We are no longer children of a single edited book. We are the heirs to a cosmic legacy. And that is a truth that no council can ever truly erase. The archives of the heart are opening. The memory of the stars is waking up. We turn now from the ink of the priests to the blood of the kings, where the legacy of the Anunnaki was preserved in the very genes of our ancestors. The story continues, and the truth is closer than you think. Stay with us as we uncover the final secrets of the Vatican's greatest fear. Good night, and keep your eyes on the horizon where the past and the future meet. We have walked through the vaults of buried clay. We have heard the whispers of a flood that erased the world, and a garden where man was molded from the dust. But the Vatican does not only look backward into the ruins of Mesopotamia. It looks upward into the infinite, velvet dark of the stars. For centuries, a specific order of men has stood at the crossroads of faith and physics. The Jesuits, they are the soldiers of the church and the keepers of the lens. While the world prays in the pews, the Jesuit astronomers are in their towers, peering through glass, tracking the movement of worlds we cannot see. But why does a church built on ancient scripture need modern telescopes? Why does the vicar of Christ need to know the trajectory of a comet or the birth of a distant star? Perhaps it is because they are not just looking for the hand of God. They are looking for the return of something they have feared since the day the clay tablets were first read. They are looking for the Anunnaki. To understand the dilemma of the Jesuit astronomers, We must first understand who they are. Founded as a Society of Jesus, they were meant to be the intellectual shield of the Vatican. They were explorers, mathematicians, and scientists. While other orders focus on the poverty of the spirit, the Jesuits focus on the power of a mind. In the 16th century, it was a Jesuit named Christopher Clavius who reshaped time itself, helping create the Gregorian calendar we still use today. They understood that to control the world, one must first understand the heavens. But with that understanding came a dangerous realization. The more they mapped the stars, the more they realized the ancient Sumerians had already been there. Thousands of years before the first telescope was polished, the people of Sumer had mapped the planets. They knew of Uranus and Neptune. They knew the colors of the gas giants. And they spoke of one more world, a world called Nibiru, the place from which the Anunnaki descended. Imagine a Jesuit priest sitting in the silence of the Vatican Observatory at Castel Gandolfo, surrounded by instruments of precision. He looks at the ancient star charts of Babylon and Sumer. He sees the same patterns, the same orbits. The Sumerians claimed that their gods were not spirits in a distant heaven, but physical travelers from a wandering planet. If this is true, then the heavens are not a spiritual realm. They are geography. And if the heavens are geography, then the angels are not divine messengers, but something far more tangible. This is the stardust that leads to sacrilege. If the Anunnaki were real, then the Vatican's monopoly on the divine begins to crumble. The Church teaches that man is the center of the universe, the unique creation of a single God. But the stars suggest a different story. A story where we are one of many experiments, a seed planted by travelers who might one day return to harvest what they have sown. The dilemma grew deeper as technology advanced. Today, the Vatican does not only look at the stars from the hills of Italy. They have extended their reach to the desert of Arizona. On Mount Graham, the Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope scans the deep infrared. It is a mountain of eyes where the Church watches the horizon of the solar system. And nearby stands another instrument, one that carries a name that has fueled 1,000 whispers, Lucifer. The scientists claim the name is merely an acronym for a complex cooling and camera system. But to those who follow the trail of the Anunnaki, the name is a signal. Lucifer, the light bringer, the fallen one who brought forbidden knowledge to man. On that mountain, the Church is looking for something that does not emit much light. They are looking for a shadow, a planet with a massive elliptical orbit that brings it near the Earth once every few thousand years. The Sumerians told us that when this world returns, the gods return with it. The Jesuit astronomers are the watchmen on the wall, waiting to see if the ancient clay was telling the truth about the sky. But why the fear? Why would the return of the Anunnaki be the Vatican's greatest nightmare? Because a god you can see is a god you can no longer control. For 2,000 years, the Church has been the bridge between the visible and the invisible. They hold the keys to a kingdom that no one can visit until they die. But if the Anunnaki return in ships of metal and light, the bridge is no longer needed. If our creators are flesh and blood, then our religions are merely half-remembered history. The Jesuit astronomers face a choice that would break a common man. They are men of science who see the anomalies in the gravity of the outer planets. They are men of faith who know that the arrival of a physical creator would render the papacy obsolete. And so they study in silence. They gather the data. They track the infrared signatures. And they send their reports into the secret archives. The public is told that the search for extraterrestrial life is a way to marvel at the diversity of creation. But behind the scenes, the Jesuits are preparing for a theological collision. They call it exotheology. the study of how the Church will survive the discovery of other beings. The Vatican has already begun to lay the groundwork. They have held conferences where they discuss the possibility of baptizing aliens. They have issued statements saying that there is no limit to the creativity of God. It sounds like a gesture of openness, but to those who know the history of the Anunnaki, it is a defensive maneuver. It is an attempt to claim the stars before the stars claim us. By saying that aliens are also children of God, the Church is trying to fold the Anunnaki into their own narrative. They are trying to turn the ancient gods back into angels. They are trying to make sure that even if the Sumerian tablets are proven true, the Bible remains the final word. But stardust is hard to contain, and the math of the Jesuits is beginning to point toward a reality that no sermon can explain away. The clay remembers the beginning, and the telescopes are watching for the end. When the Jesuit astronomers look through their lenses, they are looking at the same sky that the priests of Enlil watch from the tops of ziggurats. They see the same cycles, the same cosmic rhythm. The Sumerian king list speaks of a time when kingship was lowered from heaven. The Bible speaks of a time when the sons of God came down to the daughters of men. To the Jesuit, these are not just verses. They are data points. They suggest that the history of humanity is not a straight line of progress, but a series of encounters with something greater than ourselves, something that comes from the stars and returns to them. If the Anunnaki are indeed the watchers who shaped our DNA, then our prayers are being sent to an empty house. The Jesuits know this risk. They walk a tightrope between the laboratory and the altar. Every new planet they discover, every new anomaly they track, brings them closer to the moment when the silence must be broken. Imagine the tension in a room where a Jesuit astronomer presents his findings to a cardinal. He shows the infrared images of a massive body moving through the dark. He points to the perturbations in the orbits of the outer reaches of our system. He compares it to the 7 tablets of creation, where the movement of celestial bodies was described as a battle of gods. The cardinal listens, his hands resting on a ring that symbolizes the authority of 2 millennia. The astronomer speaks of the return. He speaks of the cycles of Sumer. The cardinal speaks of the need for order, the need for the faith of the simple. And so, the data is filed away. The discovery is given a technical name that hides its true meaning. The public is told that the search continues, but that nothing has been found. The Jesuits continue their watch, silent sentinels on a mountain of secrets. They are the only ones who know that the sacrilege they fear is not a demon from hell. It is a shadow in the stars. But stardust cannot be silenced forever. Just as the clay tablets were uncovered by the wind and the spade, the secrets of the sky are being uncovered by the lens. Other telescopes, not owned by the Vatican, are scanning the same sectors. Amateur astronomers and independent scientists are starting to see the same shadows. The Church is losing its ability to be the sole gatekeeper of the heavens. This is why the fear is rising. The Vatican feared the Anunnaki in the past because their memory challenged the uniqueness of the Bible. They fear the Anunnaki in the future because their presence would challenge the necessity of the Church. If the stardust from which we were made is the same stardust that brought our creators here, then the story of humanity is far older and far more complex than any one religion can hold. The Jesuit astronomer's dilemma is a dilemma of us all. Do we cling to the comfort of the story we were told, or do we have the courage to look through the lens and see the travelers who are coming home? As we stand at the end of this journey into the stars, we realize that the Vatican has always been playing a long game. From the editing of the clay tablets to the building of infrared telescopes, the goal has been the same: to manage the encounter between man and the ancient ones. to keep the Anunnaki in the realm of myth, so they do not become the reality of the present. But the sky does not care about the decrees of Rome. The planets follow their orbits regardless of what is written in the secret archives. The Jesuit astronomers know that the clock is ticking. The cycles of the Sumerians are reaching their conclusion. The stardust is settling, and the sacrilege is becoming the truth. We are not the center of the universe. We are a single verse in a much longer song, a song that began in the clay of Mesopotamia and will end among the stars. If you have found this exploration of the Jesuit dilemma fascinating, I invite you to subscribe. By subscribing, you join a community of seekers who are not afraid to look beyond the narrative. You help us continue to pull back the veil on the secrets the Vatican has guarded for centuries. And if you believe that the truth of our origins lies in the stars, share this video. Let others know that the watchmen are on the wall, and that the shadows they see are the echoes of our oldest ancestors. Together, we will keep our eyes on the horizon, where the past and the future meet in the light of the returning stars. And so, we leave the observatories of Arizona and the halls of Castel Gandolfo. We leave the Jesuits to their silent vigil and their forbidden math. The story of why the Vatican feared the Anunnaki is not just a story of ancient history. It is a story of our current moment. It is the tension between what we are told to believe and what we are beginning to see. The clay spoke of them. The Bible edited them. The telescopes are searching for them. The Anunnaki are the thread that connects the dust of the earth to the dust of the stars. And whether we find them in a ruin or through a lens, we will finally have to face the truth of who we are, not the masters of the world, but the children of the travelers. Not a lonely creation, but a small part of a vast, crowded, and ancient cosmos. As you look up tonight, remember that the Jesuits are looking too. They are watching for a sign that the silence is ending, and perhaps, in the dark between the stars, the Anunnaki are looking back. Good night, and may you find peace in the vastness of the truth. In the high deserts of Arizona, where the heat of the day turns into a biting mountain chill, a silent sentinel watches the heavens. It stands on the peak of Mount Graham, a place the Apache people have long held as a doorway to the spirit world. This is the Mount Graham International Observatory. It is a city of glass and steel, perched high above the clouds, away from the lights of man. And within this complex, the Vatican maintains a presence that many find deeply unsettling. It is a place where priests trade their Bibles for lenses and their prayers for data. Here, the Church is not looking back at the past, but staring directly into the future. They are searching for something. They are watching for a return. For centuries, the Vatican has been the guardian of secrets buried in the earth. We have seen how they handled the clay tablets of Sumer and the forbidden books of the Apocrypha. They worked to edit the story of our origins, to trim the many voices of the Anunnaki into the singular voice of their God. But as the centuries turned, the Church realized that history is not only buried in the dust, it is also written in the light of distant stars. If the gods of the clay truly came from the heavens, then the heavens are where they will reappear. To control the narrative of the beginning, the Vatican must also control the narrative of the end. This realization led them to the peaks of Arizona. Among the massive instruments that pierce the dark, one name echoes with chilling familiarity: Lucifer. It is a name that has sparked 1,000 theories and 1,000,000 whispers. Officially, the name is an acronym. It stands for Large Binocular Telescope Near Infrared Utility with Camera and Integral Field Unit for Extragalactic Research. It is a complex piece of technology designed to see what the human eye cannot. It peers into the infrared spectrum, looking through clouds of cosmic dust to find the heat of hidden worlds. But to the public, the name is a provocation. Why would the Church, which has spent 2,000 years warning us of the bringer of light, choose to associate itself with a device bearing his name? The Vatican astronomers will tell you it is a coincidence of naming, a technical label chosen by German scientists. They will say they only use a telescope, they do not own it. But in the world of symbols, there are no coincidences. Lucifer means light bringer. In the ancient myths, he was the one who brought forbidden knowledge to mankind. He was the watcher who fell from grace. By placing their gaze behind a lens named Lucifer, the Church is making a statement whether they admit it or not. They are looking for the light that was once lost. They are searching for the knowledge that the Anunnaki once carried. The Jesuit priests who run the Vatican Observatory are not simple monks. They are world-class scientists, men with doctorates in physics and astronomy. They speak of the vastness of the universe with a calm that is almost frightening. When asked about the possibility of life on other worlds, they do not flinch. Father Jose Funes, a former director of the observatory, once stated that the existence of extraterrestrials does not contradict the faith. He spoke of our extraterrestrial brothers, suggesting that they might even be free from original sin. This is a staggering shift in theology. For a church that once burned men for saying the earth moved around the sun, to now embrace the idea of brothers in the stars suggests a deeper motive. They are preparing the world for a disclosure. They are laying the groundwork for a day when the sky is no longer empty. If the Anunnaki were the architects of our past, their return would shatter every sermon and every scripture ever written. The Church knows this. They have seen the clay. They have read the stories of the gods who shaped man from earth. They know that if these beings appear again, they will not come as demons or angels, but as creators. And so, the Church must be the first to see them. They must be the ones to define who they are before the rest of the world has a chance to ask questions. The Lucifer telescope is uniquely equipped for this task. Because it sees in the infrared, it can detect objects that are cold and dark, objects that do not reflect the light of our sun. For decades, researchers and whistleblowers have spoken of a hidden planet, a massive body on a long, elliptical orbit that periodically enters our solar system. Some call it Nibiru. Others call it Planet X or Wormwood. In the Sumerian tablets, this was the home of the Anunnaki, the place from which they descended to Earth. If such a world exists, it would be invisible to traditional telescopes. It would hide in the shadows of the outer solar system, a cold giant moving toward us. But it would glow in the infrared. To a device like Lucifer, the heat of a distant world would shine like a beacon. The Vatican is not looking for distant galaxies or the birth of stars. They are looking for something much closer. They are watching the gates. They are waiting for the moment when the ancient masters of the clay return to claim their inheritance. This is why they built their observatory on a mountain sacred to the Apache. They wanted a place where the veil is thin, where the spirit and the material meet. They are standing on the threshold, holding a glass to the dark, waiting for the first sign of a coming storm. The Apache people fought the construction of the observatory. They spoke of the mountain as a living being, a place where the mountain spirits or the gone reside. They warned that piercing the peak with telescopes would disturb the balance of the world. But the Church and the scientists pushed forward. They needed the clarity of that air. They needed the silence of that peak. There is a strange irony in a modern religious institution desecrating an ancient sacred site to search for the return of even older gods. It is a battle of memories, one trying to bury the other. Within the halls of the Vatican, there are whispers of a secret document. It is said to be a protocol for the arrival of extraterrestrial life. It details how the Church will explain the existence of beings who possess technology that looks like magic. It suggests that the church will frame these beings not as gods, but as fellow creatures of a vast creator. This is the ultimate strategy of editing. Just as they reshaped the Anunnaki into angels and demons in the past, they are preparing to reshape them again for the modern age. They will call them brothers. They will offer to baptize them. They will try to pull them into the fold of the church before they can dismantle the church's power. But can you baptize a creator? Can you offer salvation to the ones who shaped your DNA in a garden long ago? The Lucifer telescope is a tool of desperation. It is the church trying to get ahead of a truth that they can no longer hide. The clay is speaking too loudly. Archaeology is uncovering too many parallels. The internet has allowed the forbidden books to reach the hands of the common man. The walls of the secret archives are beginning to leak. The only way left for the Vatican to maintain its hold on humanity is to be the one to introduce us to the stars. Imagine the day it happens. The telescope on Mount Graham picks up a signal. A heat signature that is not a star, not a comet, but a craft. A world within a world, moving with intent. The data is sent back to Rome, filtered through the Jesuit scholars, and analyzed by the highest levels of the hierarchy. They do not tell the world immediately. They wait. They prepare the message. They draft the speeches. When the announcement finally comes, it will be phrased in a way that protects the institution. They will tell us that our brothers have returned. They will tell us it is a miracle. But the clay remembers a different story. The clay tells us that the Anunnaki did not come in peace. They came for gold. They came to create a labor force. They were many, and they were often at war with one another. Their return would not be a religious event, but a historical one. It would be the return of the kings. The Vatican fears this more than anything. They fear a power that is older than the papacy. They fear a voice that does not need a priest to be heard. So they watch. Every night, the massive mirrors of the telescopes in Arizona pivot toward the blackness. They track the movement of the planets and the silence between the stars. They look for the light bringer. They look for the one who was cast out. They look for the heat of Nibiru. The scientists call it research. The priests call it observation. But to those who have followed the trail of the Anunnaki, it is something else entirely. It is a stakeout. The church is watching the horizon for the masters they tried to erase. The secrecy surrounding Mount Graham is intense. Security is tight, and the flow of information is carefully controlled. What have they already seen? What images are stored in the servers beneath the mountain that never reach the public eye? There are reports of strange lights over the peak, of black helicopters that move without sound, and of astronomers who suddenly go silent. It is a place of shadows, even in the bright desert sun. The Vatican has always been a master of the shadow. They know that the best way to hide a secret is to put it on top of a mountain and call it science. If you enjoy exploring these hidden corners of our modern world, remember to subscribe. By joining us, you help keep the light shining on the truths that others wish to keep in the dark. Together, we can look through the lens and see what is truly coming. The search for the return is not just about technology. It is about the survival of an era. We are living in the final days of a narrative that has lasted for 2,000 years. The age of the edited book is ending. The age of the revealed clay is beginning. The Vatican knows that their time as the sole keepers of the human story is running out. The stars are getting closer. The infrared heat is getting brighter. And the name Lucifer stands as a testament to their own fear. They are using the name of the enemy to find the ones they once called gods. We must ask ourselves what we will do when the telescopes find what they're looking for. Will we listen to the priests who tell us to welcome our brothers? Or will we look back at the clay and remember the truth of our making? The Anunnaki never truly left. They left their DNA. They left their stories. They left their monuments. And now, they are moving to the deep dark of space, returning to the garden they planted so long ago. The Vatican is not watching the sky to save our souls. They are watching the sky to save their throne. The large binocular telescope is a powerful tool. It can see the faint glow of a candle on the moon. It can see the beginning of time. But it cannot see the heart of a man who is beginning to wake up. The disclosure is already happening, not in a press conference from Rome, but in the minds of people everywhere. We are realizing that we are not alone, and we never were. We are realizing that our history is much older and much stranger than the Bible allowed us to believe. The church is staring through a glass, darkly, but we are beginning to see with our own eyes. As the sun sets over Mount Graham and the shadow of the observatory stretches across the desert, the work begins again. The mirrors cool. The sensors activate. The name Lucifer is whispered in the code of the machines. The search continues. They are looking for a planet. They are looking for a ship. They are looking for a god. But perhaps they should be looking down. Perhaps the return is not coming from the stars, but from the very clay they tried to bury. Memory is a powerful thing. It can survive for thousands of years in the dust, waiting for the right moment to rise. The Vatican fear the Anunnaki because the Anunnaki represent a truth that cannot be controlled. They represent a past that is physical, not spiritual. They represent creators who can be seen, touched, and understood. This is the greatest threat to a faith based on the invisible and the unreachable. If the creator is a being with a ship and a plan, then the priest is obsolete. The church is a middleman in a world that no longer needs one. So they hide behind the infrared. They hide behind the acronyms. They hide on the sacred mountains of the people they conquered. But the sky does not keep secrets forever. Light eventually reaches the eye. Heat eventually reaches the sensor. And the truth eventually reaches the heart. The search for return is the final act of a very old play. The actors are in place. The audience is waiting. And the curtain of the night is about to rise. Tonight, as you look up at the stars, remember that you are not just looking at points of light. You are looking at history. You are looking at the home of the ones who shaped us. And somewhere on a cold mountain peak in Arizona, a telescope named Lucifer is looking back. It is searching for the moment when the silence of the last several thousand years is finally broken. It is searching for the return of the Anunnaki. And when they find them, the world will never be the same again. Good night, and may you watch the skies with clear eyes and a steady heart. The Bible tells us that we were made in the image of God. It is a phrase we hear in Sunday schools and from gold-leaf pulpits, a comfort to the weary, a promise of divine connection. But what if that image was not a spiritual reflection? What if it was a biological blueprint, a pattern etched into our very cells by hands that were not human? For centuries, the Vatican has guarded the mystery of our origin. They speak of a breath of life and a handful of dust. But the clay of the Sumerians tells a different story. A story of a laboratory, of a mixing, of a deliberate design that predates the Garden of Eden by thousands of years. When we look into the mirror of the past, we do not see a single creator. We see a council. We see the Anunnaki. And in their ancient records, the blueprint of humanity is laid bare. Let us return to the words of Genesis. Let us make man in our image, after our likeness. For centuries, scholars have stumbled over that one word. Our. It is plural. It is a choir where we expected a solo. The church tells us it is the Trinity, a mystery of three in one. But the older tablets do not need such explanations. In the ruins of Sumer, the scribes were clear. There was no single voice. There was a divine assembly, a group of beings who debated the creation of a new worker, a being to carry the tools and dig the canals. They called this being the Lulu, the mixed one. This was not a creation from nothing. It was an engineering of what already existed, a bridge between the earth and the stars. The Sumerian spoke of a goddess named Ninmah and a wise god named Enki. They were the architects of the human form. On the tablets of creation, we read of a strange and intricate process. They did not just speak a word. They mixed the blood of a god with the clay of the earth. They used terms that sound hauntingly like genetic science. They spoke of the Shiru, the life force, the essence. They described the process of purification and binding. To the ancient mind, this was magic. To the modern eye, it looks like a map of the genome. When the Vatican looks at these tablets, they see a threat to the soul. If we were engineered, then where's the divine spark? If we were designed for labor, then where is the glory? This is why the clay was hidden. It suggests that our creators were not mystical spirits, but physical masters of a high and ancient science. The blueprint of the Anunnaki was not perfect on the first try. The tablets of Sumer are honest in a way that Scripture is not. They speak of failed experiments, of beings with bodies that did not function, of trials and errors in the dark. Ninmah and Enki argued over their work, refining the design until a first successful prototype emerged. They called him the Adamu, the one who is of the earth. This is the echo of our Adam. But in the older story, he was not the only one. He was the first of many, a biological success that would be replicated to serve the needs of the gods. When we read this, the Garden of Eden changes. It is no longer a paradise of innocence. It becomes a place of containment, a controlled environment where the new species could be observed and managed. The Vatican has spent 2,000 years insisting that humanity is unique, that we are a special creation, set apart from the rest of the world. But the Anunnaki tablets tell us we are a hybrid, a blend of terrestrial DNA and extraterrestrial essence. This is the secret that would unravel the power of the church. If we are a mixture, then the boundary between the holy and the profane disappears. We are both. We carry the dust of the earth and the blood of the stars in the same vein. The church could not allow this complexity. They needed a story of a fall, a story of sin that required a savior. But if we are an engineered species, then our flaws are not sins. They are a part of the design. They are the leftovers of the experiment. Consider the story of the rib. In Genesis, Eve is formed from the side of Adam. It is a strange detail that has puzzled believers for generations. Why a rib? Why not the earth again? The answer lies in a Sumerian pun that was lost in translation. In the ancient tongue, the word T means both rib and life. When the goddess Ninmah healed the rib of a god, she was also creating life. This play on words was carved into clay long before the Hebrew scribes reached for their pens. When the story was retold in the Bible, the pun was forgotten, but the rib remained. A fragment of forgotten science turned into a miraculous myth. It is a trace of the laboratory, a memory of a cellular extraction. If you are beginning to see the patterns in the dust, I invite you to subscribe. By joining us, you help pull back the veil that has covered these truths for far too long. Together, we follow the whispers of the Sumerians into the heart of the Vatican. The fear of the Vatican is a fear of the plural. If there were many creators, then there can be many truths. The church built its foundation on the rock of monotheism. One God, one church, one path to salvation. But the Anunnaki were a council. They were a family of beings with different agendas, different tempers, and different roles. Anki was a protector, the one who gave us wisdom. Enlil was the taskmaster, the one who found us too noisy and too numerous. Our history is not a straight line of divine love. It is a tug of war between different factions of our creators. One side wanted us to be wise and free. The other wanted us to be obedient and quiet. This conflict is written into the pages of the Bible, but it is masked. The voices of the many are compressed into the voice of the one. When we look at the Ten Commandments, we see the laws of a jealous God, a God who demands that no other gods be placed before him. This is not the voice of a lonely creator. It is the voice of a ruler trying to erase his rivals. It is a political decree. In the ancient world, the Anunnaki fought for the loyalty of the cities. Each god had their own territory, their own people, their own temple. When the Hebrew scribes began to write their history, they chose one side. They took the laws of the council and turned them into the laws of the Lord. They simplified the blueprint. They removed the names of the architects and left only the name of the owner. The Vatican knows that the clay tablets of Mesopotamia are the original blueprints. They are the rough drafts of the Bible. In the secret archives, they hold the comparisons. They know that the story of creation in Genesis follows the exact same sequence as the Enuma Elish, the separation of the waters, the fixing of the stars, the creation of man. But the Enuma Elish is older. It is more detailed. It is more raw. It describes a cosmic war that resulted in the order of the world. By choosing the shorter, calmer version in Genesis, the church removed the fingerprints of the Anunnaki. They turned the biological and political history into a moral fable. What happens to the soul if the body is an engineered vessel? This is the question that haunts the high halls of Rome. If the Anunnaki designed us, then the soul is not a gift from a distant heaven. It is a part of the biological essence they shared with us. The breath of life was not a magical puff of air. It was the spark of consciousness, the divine fire. The Sumerians believed that the gods gave us their own wisdom, even when it was forbidden. They saw the serpent in the garden not as a demon, but as a teacher, a being who wanted the Adamu to know the truth of their own blueprint. To the church, this knowledge is the original sin. But to the Sumerians, it was the moment we became truly human. The blueprint is still within us. Our DNA carries the markers of a journey that began in the stars and was shaped in the clay of the Euphrates. Modern science is beginning to find the anomalies, sections of our genetic code that seem to appear out of nowhere, rapid jumps in evolution that shouldn't happen by chance. We are a species with amnesia, looking for our parents in the wrong places. The Vatican offers a father in the clouds. The clay tablets offer a counsel in the ruins. One requires blind faith. The other requires us to remember what was erased. As we walk through the silent corners of the past, we find that the truth is not hidden because it is weak. It is hidden because it is powerful. To know our blueprint is to know our potential. It is to realize that we are not servants of a singular, distant master. We are the legacy of a complex and ancient lineage. The Anunnaki did not just make us. They left themselves inside us. And that is what the Vatican truly fears. Not the devil in the shadows, but the God in the mirror. Tonight, as the stars watch over the earth, think of the clay. Think of the wedges pressed into wet earth 5,000 years ago. They are still speaking. They are telling us that we are part of a divine blueprint that no church can fully contain. The script is written in our blood. The memory is held in our bones. And the silence is finally beginning to break. We must continue to follow the trail. From the laboratories of the Anunnaki to the altars of Rome. From the first mixed being to the modern soul. The journey is long, but the destination is our own identity. If you have the courage to look at the blueprint, then you have the power to see the truth. Good night, and may you find the strength to read the story written in your own heart. For the clay remembers, and the stars never forget. Together, we will walk into the next chapter of the history rarely told. We will see the towers that were built to reach the heavens and confusion that was sent to tear them down. Until then, keep your eyes on the horizon and your mind open to the echoes of the past. The earth has always remembered the water. It remembers the weight of a world submerged and the silence of a species erased. In the halls of the Vatican, the flood is taught as a story of divine justice. We are told of a world of sinners swept away by the tears of a grieving God. We are told of Noah, the one righteous man, who carried the seed of humanity into a new dawn. It is a story of morality, of sin, and of redemption. But in the older archives and the stories carved into the wet clay of Mesopotamia thousands of years before the Bible, the waters had a different purpose. They were not just a punishment for the soul. They were a cleansing of the blood. When we look at the tablets of the Atrahasis or the Epic of Gilgamesh, a darker motive emerges. The gods of the Anunnaki did not bring the flood because of human sin. They brought the flood because of human noise. To the modern ear, noise sounds like sound, like the shouting of crowds or the clamorous cities. But to the scribes of Sumer, noise was something more. It was the interference of a genetic line that had grown too complex, too wild, and too mixed. It was the genetic record of a world that had moved beyond the control of its creators. Imagine a world where the boundaries between gods and men had blurred too far. A world where the genetic experiments of the Anunnaki had filled the earth with creatures that should not exist. Hybrids, giants, beings of mixed essence who did not fit the original design. These were the Nephilim mentioned in the quiet corners of Genesis. These were the heroes of old, the men of renown. But to the leadership of the Anunnaki, specifically to the god Enlil, they were a mistake. They were the noise that kept the gods from their rest. And so, the flood was designed as a reset button, a way to wipe the biological slate clean and start again with a controlled, singular line. This is the truth the Vatican fears. They do not fear the water. They fear the reason for the water. They fear the idea that humanity was not a perfect creation, but a corrected experiment. For centuries, the Church has guarded the narrative of the Garden of Eden and the fall of man. They have built a theology on the idea that we are born in sin. But if the flood was actually a genetic cleansing, then the concept of original sin changes completely. It is no longer moral failure. It is a biological legacy. The Vatican knows that the Sumerian texts describe a great debate in the Council of the Gods. Enlil, the administrator, wanted humanity destroyed. He saw them as a failed crop, a biological contamination that had grown out of hand. But Enki, the scientist and the creator of man, wanted to save the seed of his work. The story of Noah is the story of Enki's secret intervention. In the Sumerian version, Enki whispers to the wall of a reed hut, knowing that the hero Atrahasis is listening on the other side. He gives him the instructions for the vessel. He tells him to bring the seeds of all living things. In the language of the modern world, we might call this a gene bank, a survival kit for a specific biological code. When the waters receded, what was left was not just a family of survivors, but a filtered genetic record. The giant were gone. The hybrids were washed away. The noise was silenced. Why does the Vatican hide this? Because to admit that the flood was a biological reset is to admit that the Anunnaki were not distant spirits, but physical architects. It would mean that our history is not one of divine providence, but of intervention and editing. The Church prefers a story of morality because morality can be managed through faith. Biology, however, is a matter of evidence. If the evidence of the pre-flood world still exists, hidden in the sands or locked in the vaults, it would prove that the Bible is a redacted version of a much older and more complex reality. Think of the silence that followed the deluge. The clay tablets tell us that the gods themselves were hungry when they returned to the earth because there was no one left to provide for them. They wept when they saw the destruction. They realized that in their haste to cleanse a record, they had nearly destroyed their own labor force. This is not the behavior of an all-knowing, all-powerful deity. This is the behavior of a council of rulers who made a catastrophic mistake. The Vatican has spent nearly 2,000 years smoothing over these rough edges of history. They have taken the violent, messy, and biological reality of the Anunnaki and polished it into the solemn verses of Genesis. They have turned the genetic purge into a moral lesson. But the echoes remain in the text itself. In the book of Genesis, God looks at the earth and sees that it is corrupt. The word used for corruption in the original language often refers to a physical decay or perversion of nature. It was not just that people were being mean to one another. It was that the very fabric of life had been altered. The genetic record had been compromised. This is why the story of the flood is so central to the Vatican's power. It represents the moment when the old world, the world of the Anunnaki and their direct interference, was officially ended. It was the moment the current age began. By controlling the story of the flood, the Church controls the story of our transition from a species with many masters to a species with one God. They have made sure that we do not look back past the waters. They want us to believe that history began with Noah and that the world before him was nothing but a shadow of sin. But the clay remembers. The tablets found in the library of Nineveh tell us that the hero of the flood was given a gift. He was given the secret of life and was taken to live at the mouth of the rivers. He was a biological bridge between the old world and the new. In the Bible, Noah lived for centuries, a final remnant of the pre-flood longevity. This longevity was not a miracle. It was a trait. It was part of the original genetic code that was slowly being phased out in the generations that followed. As the generations passed, the human lifespan shortened. The noise was reduced. The connection to the divine creators became a distant memory. The Vatican has served as the guardian of this distance. They ensure that we do not ask why our ancestors lived for 900 years while we struggle to reach 100. They ensure that we do not ask who the sons of God were who saw the daughters of men and found them fair. They ensure that the flood remains a wall of water that blocks our view of our true origins. If you are beginning to see the patterns in silence, I invite you to subscribe to this journey. By following the trail of the Anunnaki, you are helping to peel back the layers of parchment that have hidden the clay for so long. Together, we are looking into the waters and seeing more than just a flood. We are seeing a cleansing of the record. The fear held by the Vatican is that one day, the physical evidence of the pre-flood hybrids will be undeniable. They fear that archaeology will find the remains of the noise that Enlil tried to silence. Already, there are whispers of elongated skulls, of giant bones found in the Americas and the Middle East, of structures beneath the ocean that predate any known civilization. Each of these findings is a crack in the wall of the flood. Each one suggests that the cleansing was not complete. What if the genetic record was not entirely wiped clean? What if the noise survived in small pockets, hidden in the bloodlines of certain families or protected in secret locations? The Sumerian myths hint that some of the Anunnaki themselves were unhappy with the destruction. They may have left behind legacies that the Church has been trying to hunt down and suppress for centuries. The Crusades, the Inquisitions, the secret wars of the Middle Ages. Were these truly about faith, or were they about identifying and removing the last traces of the old genetic code? The flood was a turning point. It was the moment the Anunnaki moved from being visible kings to being invisible gods. They stepped back from the world, leaving behind a cleansed population and a set of rules. The Vatican became the administrator of those rules. They became the new Enlil, keeping the noise down, ensuring that humanity remained within its assigned boundaries. They have done their job well. Most of the world looks at the story of Noah and sees a children's tale with animals and a rainbow. They do not see the laboratory. They do not see the purge. They do not see the genetic reset. But the silence of the Vatican is the greatest clue of all. They do not debate the Sumerian tablets because they cannot. To engage with the Atrahasis is to admit that the Bible is a retelling. To admit the Bible is a retelling is to invite the world to look at the original version. And in the original version, we are not children of a loving Father. We are the survivors of a biological management project. We are the ones who were allowed to live because our genetic code was finally quiet enough to tolerate. As we move forward, we must look deeper into what survived the waters. It was not just Noah and his family. It was a specific blueprint for humanity, a blueprint that had been guarded and edited by the church for 2 millennia. The flood was the first great act of censorship. It was a cleansing of the earth, but also the cleansing of the memory. The Vatican's greatest fear is that the memory is coming back, that the noise is rising once again. The tablets tell us that after the flood, the gods established a new order. They set the bounds of human life and the ways in which we would serve. This new order is what the church calls the divine plan. But if you look through the lens of the Anunnaki, it is simply a new management strategy. The waters have receded, but the secrets they were meant to bury are still there, waiting in the mud and the clay. Tonight, as we reflect on the great deluge, we must ask ourselves if we are ready to see what lies beneath the waves. The Vatican has spent centuries building a boat of faith to keep us above the truth, but the water is clearing. The sun is hitting the ruins of the old world, and the genetic record is beginning to speak for itself. The cleansing was not the end. It was only the beginning of the secret history we are now uncovering. The story of the flood is not over. It continues in every discovery that challenges the church's narrative. It continues in every person who asks why the stories of Sumer feel more like history than myth. The Anunnaki have left their mark on our marrow and our memory. No amount of water can wash that away, and no amount of silence from the Vatican can keep the clay from speaking. As we conclude this segment, we stand at the edge of the new world, looking back at the one that was lost. We see the rainbow not just as a promise, but as a seal on a closed file. But that file is being opened. The genetic record is being read. And the truth about why the waters rose is finally coming to light. Until we meet again, stay curious and keep searching for the whispers in the silent corners of the past. Good night. For centuries, the Vatican has looked toward the heavens, not to find a spiritual God, but to watch for a physical guest. High in the mountains of Arizona, far from the marble halls of Rome, sits an eye that never blinks. The Vatican Advanced Technology Telescope. It is a marvel of glass and light, managed by the Jesuits, the Church's most learned scholars. But why does a religious institution need to scan the depths of space? Why does the papacy employ astronomers to track the movements of distant stars? Whispers from the corridors of the Vatican hint at a secret that goes beyond prayer. They are not looking for the beginning of the universe. They are looking for the return of a shadow. They are looking for Nibiru. In the ancient language of the Sumerians, Nibiru meant the place of crossing. It was described in the Enuma Elish as a celestial body that disrupted the order of the stars to the people of Mesopotamia. It was a home of the Anunnaki, the gods who descended to earth to shape mankind. But this was not a static heaven. It was a planet with a vast elliptical orbit, a traveler that returns only once every few thousand years. When Nibiru approaches, the earth feels its weight. The tides rise. The earth shakes. The very air begins to change. To the Sumerians, this was a cosmic cycle as regular as the seasons, though far more terrifying. To the Vatican, this cycle is a clock that is ticking toward an hour they have spent 2,000 years trying to prevent. The Church has always spoken of the end of the world. They call it the apocalypse, the second coming, the day of judgment. In the book of Revelation, we read of a great star called wormwood that falls from the sky, turning the waters bitter. We read of signs in the sun and the moon. In most sermons, these are treated as symbols of divine anger. But if you peel back the layers of Scripture, you find something more physical. You find a memory of a returning body, a wandering world that brings the gods back to their creation. The Vatican fears Nibiru because Nibiru brings the truth. If the Anunnaki return, the story of the one God is shattered. The myth of a singular creator, distant and silent, would be replaced by the presence of flesh and blood masters. The Church's authority rests on being the only bridge between man and the divine. If the divine lands in a ship, the bridge is no longer needed. The papacy becomes a relic of a time when we were blind. Imagine the panic in the secret chambers of the Holy See. Reports from the Arizona Observatory arrive in coded messages. The astronomers track a gravitational pull that should not be there, a disturbance in the outer edges of our solar system. They have known for decades that something is coming. In the 1980s, the world briefly heard of Planet X, a mysterious 10th planet detected by infrared satellites. Then the news went silent. The papers stopped writing. The scientists stopped speaking. But the Vatican did not stop watching. They have poured millions into their telescopes, into their archives, into their studies of the ancient Sumerian path. They know that the prophets of the Bible were not just seeing visions. They were recording memories of the last time Nibiru passed. And they were warning of the next. The prophecy of Nibiru is the ultimate threat to the Vatican's narrative. If the Anunnaki are the creators, then the fall of man was not a sin of the spirit. It was a moment of biological engineering. If the return of Nibiru is the return of our makers, then the Church is not a guardian. It is a squatter in a house that belongs to someone else. This is why they watch. This is why they wait. They are waiting to see if their power can survive the arrival of the older gods. Some believe the third secret of Fatima, a mystery the Vatican kept hidden for decades, was not about war or popes. It was about the heavens. It was a warning that the sky would open and the ancient ones would be seen again. The panic within the papacy is not about the end of life, but the end of their story. When the sun darkens and the stars shift, the world will look up and see the crossing. And in that moment, the sermons of Rome will fall silent before the reality of the clay. Why did the Jesuits build a telescope named Lucifer? The Church claims the name is an acronym, a coincidence of language. But in the ancient world, Lucifer was a morning star, the light bringer. In Sumerian myth, the gods often appeared as bright stars, descending from the heights to walk among men. By naming their technology after the light bringer, are they mocking us, or are they acknowledging the truth? They are searching for the light of the returning masters. They are tracking the home of the Anunnaki. The Vatican's secret archives are said to hold maps that no museum has ever seen. Maps that show the path of Nibiru across the millennia. They have calculated the arrival, They have seen the signs. And they know that when the crossing happens, the Bible will have to be rewritten one final time. Or perhaps it will simply be discarded as an edited fragment of a much larger truth. The return of Nibiru is not just an astronomical event. It is a spiritual crisis. If the Anunnaki return, they will find a world governed by institutions that have used their name to control the masses. They will find a church that has turned their history into a mystery. How would the creators react to seeing their children enslaved by a narrative of fear? The Vatican fears this confrontation. They fear the moment when the creators look at the Vatican and see a fortress built on secrets. So they prepare. They build telescopes in the desert. They send priests to study the stars. They keep the ancient clay tablets locked in the dark, away from the eyes of the curious. But you cannot lock away a planet. You cannot hide the movement of the cosmos behind a curtain of incense. The sky remembers what the scrolls have tried to forget. In the final days, the Bible says the heavens will be rolled up like a scroll. Maybe this is not a metaphor for destruction, but for revelation. The scroll of the church is being pulled back to show the clay of Sumer. The prophecy of Nibiru is the prophecy of the return to our roots. It is the promise that the silence of the gods will not last forever. The panic in the papacy is the realization that they are running out of time. For 2,000 years, they have been the masters of the story. But the story is reaching its final chapter, and the original authors are coming back to check the work. The Vatican has warned us of the devil, of demons, of the end of days. But their greatest fear is the light of a crossing planet, the light that reveals we were never alone, and we were never the masters of our own destiny. As we stand at the edge of this discovery, we must ask ourselves a question. Who are we waiting for? Are we waiting for the judgment of a spirit or the return of a physical kin? The Vatican chooses to watch the sky through the lens of a telescope because they know the answer is material. They know that the heavens are not empty. They know that the Anunnaki are not just a memory in clay. They are a presence in the dark, moving toward us with the weight of the ages. If you find yourself looking at the stars and wondering what hides in the shadows between them, you are not alone. The Jesuits are looking with you, but they're looking with fear, while we should look with a desire to finally know our own name. The return is coming. The prophecy is unfolding, and the papacy is trembling. If you are drawn to these mysteries, if you feel the pull of the crossing planet in your own heart, join us. Like this video and subscribe to our journey. Together, we will watch the horizon and wait for the light that the Vatican has tried to keep for itself. We will follow the trail where the stars and the clay meet. The history we have been told is only a fragment. The history that is coming is the whole truth. Nibiru is the place of crossing, and we are the ones who must cross from the age of shadows into the age of sight. The clock is ticking. The telescopes are focused, and the truth is no longer a secret kept in a vault. It is a planet rising in the dark. Good night, and keep your eyes on the stars. Imagine a vault, not a vault of stone and iron, but a vault of silence. Deep beneath the stone floors where incense smoke rises, there's a history that the church has spent 2,000 years trying to rewrite. We have been taught to look at the altar as a place of light. But what if the altar is actually a seal, a heavy weight placed upon a truth that refuses to stay buried? Tonight, we move away from the general stories and into the most dangerous secret of all, the story of a God who loved humanity too much. The story of the secret gospel of Enki. To the Vatican, this is the ultimate heresy. It is not a heresy of demons or of darkness. It is a heresy of memory. It is the realization that the one we were told was our enemy might have been our greatest friend, and the one we were told to fear might have been the one who try to end our story before it even began. To understand why the Vatican fears the Anunnaki, we must look at the duality of the gods. In the clay of Sumer, there were two brothers, Enlil, the lord of the storm, and Enki, the lord of the deep waters. Enlil viewed humanity as a mistake. He saw us as noisy, troublesome, and unnecessary. But Enki saw something else. He saw a spark. He saw a potential that reached toward the stars. When we read the Bible, we see a God who is sometimes loving and sometimes vengeful, a God who creates man in his image, but then floods the world to destroy him, a God who gives life, but then demands absolute blind obedience. Scholars have long noted this strange, split personality in the Old Testament. The clay tablets of Mesopotamia explain why. The biblical God is not one being. He is a composite. The scribes took the roles of two warring brothers and merged them into one singular voice. They took the mercy of Enki and the wrath of Enlil and bound them together in a narrative of monotheism. But in doing so, they had to hide the most vital part of the story. They had to turn the Savior into a villain. In the Sumerian accounts, it was Enki who stood in the council of the gods and argued for our lives. It was Enki who went behind his brother's back to warn the flood hero of the coming waters. He was the architect of our survival. But when the stories were rewritten for the Bible, Enki's role was transformed. His wisdom was called deception. His gift of knowledge was called a curse. And his image, the twisting serpent of the deep waters, was turned into the symbol of the devil. This is the secret gospel that the Vatican guards with such intensity, the knowledge that our origins are not found in sin, but in a struggle for consciousness. The Vatican tells us that the serpent in the garden was a tempter who brought about the fall of man. But in the secret history of the Anunnaki, the serpent was a teacher, the one who gave humanity the ability to see, to know, and to understand our own divinity. To the Church, this is the highest form of heresy. If humanity was meant to have knowledge, then the gatekeepers of faith are no longer necessary. If the serpent was a benefactor, then the entire structure of the Church's authority begins to crumble. The high altar is built on the premise that man is fallen and needs a mediator. But the clay tablets tell us that man was uplifted, and the mediator is the very one we were told to fear. This reversal is the foundation of the Vatican's control. They have taken the ancient memory of our Creator God and painted it with the colors of the abyss. They have taken the one who gave us the spark of life and called him the father of lies. And why? Because a humanity that knows its true origin cannot be easily ruled. A humanity that remembers its divine engineer does not need a throne in Rome to tell it how to speak to heaven. The secret gospel of Enki is not a book you can find in a library. It is a collection of fragments. It is found in the Gnostic text of Nag Hammadi, where the serpent is described as a bringer of light. It is found in the legends of the Akalu, the 7 sages who brought civilization to the world. It is found in the very DNA that the Anunnaki are said to have shaped. Every time we reach for knowledge, every time we question the authorities of the earth, we are echoing the gospel of Enki. We are reaching for the fruit that was never meant to be forbidden. The Vatican knows that if these stories become common knowledge, the narrative of the Bible becomes a tragedy of editing. They know that the God of the Old Testament often behaves more like the jealous Enlil than the wise Enki. The flood, the confusion of languages at Babel, the destruction of cities. These are the act of a God who fears human potential. Enki, on the other hand, was a god of the arts, of science, and of the secrets of the earth. He wanted humanity to build, to create, and to transcend. By merging these two, The church created a God that is impossible to satisfy, a God who wants you to grow, but punishes you for knowing. This confusion is a tool of power, but the clay remembers the truth. When the ruins of Nineveh were uncovered, the scholars found the Epic of Atrahasis. In those lines, they read the original account of the creation of man. They read how Enki mixed the blood of a god with the clay of the earth to create a being that could carry the burden of the world. He did not create us to be slaves. He created us to be successors. This is the hidden truth behind the high altar. The church presents itself as a defender of humanity against the darkness. But if the darkness is actually the suppressed memory of our benefactor, then who is the church actually defending? They are defending the narrative of the storm god. They are defending the authority of Enlil, the one who wanted to silence the flood. They are keeping us in a state of spiritual childhood, afraid of the very knowledge that would set us free. This is why the archives are secret. This is why the apocryphal books are banned. It is not because they are false. It is because they are too true. They reveal a universe that is far more complex than a simple battle between good and evil. They reveal a history of cosmic politics, of divine disagreements, and of a humanity that was caught in the middle. Enki was the rebel in the divine council. He was the one who refused to let his creation be snuffed out. And for that act of love, he has been branded as the adversary for 2,000 years. But names can be changed. Stories can be edited. The truth, however, is written in the bones of history. The Vatican may hold the keys to the archives, but they do not hold the keys to our memory. As we look at the ruins of Mesopotamia and the verses of the Bible side by side, the masks begin to slip. We see the jealous brother and the wise teacher. We see the flood and the warning. We see the serpent and the tree. And we begin to realize that the heresy in the high altar is actually our own stolen inheritance. The secret gospel of Enki is a call to remember. It is a call to look past the fear and the dogma to the gods who shaped us in the deep past. The Anunnaki were not just masters or kings. They were the ones who left their fingerprints on our very souls. The Vatican fears them because they represent a power that predates the church and a truth that bypasses the priest. They fear the day when we stop looking at the altar and start looking at the clay. For in that clay, we find not a fallen creature, but a masterpiece of ancient wisdom. We find humanity that was meant to walk among the gods, not crawl before them. This is the secret that keeps the vaults locked. This is the shadow that haunts the high altar. And this is the memory that is finally beginning to wake up. The Gospel of Enki is not written in ink. It is written in our desire to know, to explore, and to survive. It is the voice that whispers that we are more than we have been told. And as that voice grows louder, the walls of the Vatican seem to grow thinner. For no silence is deep enough to hide the song of our creators forever. The truth is coming back to the light, and the clay is ready to speak again. So we continue to dig, we continue to read, and we continue to follow the trail of the serpent, not into the abyss, but back to the source of our own light. The heresy of yesterday is the history of tomorrow, and the gods of past are waiting for us to remember their names. This is the secret of the high altar. This is the fear of the Vatican. And this is the beginning of our return to the stars. Good night. And may the echoes of the deep waters lead you to the truth. For nearly 2,000 years, the throne in Rome has stood as the ultimate gatekeeper of human history. It claimed to hold the only map to our origins, the only bridge between the human and the divine. Every throne relies on a foundation, a story that cannot be questioned. For the Vatican, that story is the absolute uniqueness of the Bible. It is the belief that before the Word, there was only darkness. But the clay tells a different story. It tells us that the light was already there, shining in the cities of Sumer long before the first stone of the church was laid. This is why the Vatican fears the Anunnaki. It is not because they are demons lurking in the shadows. It is because they are predecessors. If the Anunnaki are the architects of our past, then the church is merely the tenant of a building it did not design. This is the eclipse of the throne, the moment when an older, larger truth passes in front of the light of the church, casting the entire institution into shadow. The fear is not about a loss of faith, but a loss of authority. To understand this, we must look at the nature of power. Power thrives on exclusivity. If you're the only one who can talk to God, everyone must listen to you. If your book is the only source of truth, everyone must read it. The church built its empire on the idea that the Bible was a direct, singular revelation. But the discovery of the Sumerian tablets broke that exclusivity. When scholars translated the stories of Enki and Enlil, they found the blueprints for Genesis. They found the flood, the garden, and the creation of man, all written in a language that predates the Hebrew scribes by thousands of years. The Vatican realized that its sacred text was not the original broadcast. It was a signal passed through many hands, filtered and reshaped to serve a new purpose. If the people discovered that their holy stories were edited versions of older myths, the divine patent of the church would be void. Imagine a king who claims his crown was given to him by the sun itself. His people obey him because they believe he has a unique connection to the heavens. But then, a traveler arrives with an older crown, a crown that the king's grandfather actually stole from a neighboring city. Suddenly, the king is no longer a divine representative. He is just a man holding stolen property. This is the crisis the Vatican faces with the Anunnaki. The clay tablets are the older crown. They show that the gods of the Bible were not abstract spirits, but characters in an even older drama. To admit the truth of the Anunnaki is to admit that the church's authority is built on borrowed history. And a throne built on borrowed history cannot survive the return of the original owners. The church cannot survive the truth, because the truth changes the very definition of God. In the Catholic tradition, God is an infinite, invisible, and perfect spirit. He is beyond the reach of science and the limits of biology. But the Anunnaki stories describe something very different. They describe beings who were physical, technological, and deeply flawed. They were masters of the earth and the sky, but they were also engineers who manipulated life itself. If the Anunnaki are the source of our creation stories, then our creators were not mystical beings, but advanced ones. This is a nightmare for the Vatican. If God is a physical being from another world, then religion becomes a branch of history and biology. The mystery of the divine is replaced by the reality of the extraterrestrial. The church cannot govern a world where God is someone you could meet, someone who uses tools instead of miracles. The silence of the Vatican is a strategic necessity. If you enjoy uncovering these silent corners of our past, please like this video and subscribe. Your support helps us keep walking the trail where the clay meets the scroll. Together, we are looking for the truth that was hidden behind the silver and the gold. The silence exists because the alternative is total collapse. If the Vatican were to acknowledge the Anunnaki, it would have to explain the genetic spark. The Sumerian tablets speak of the gods mixing their own essence with the earth to create a worker. This sounds hauntingly like genetic engineering. If humanity was designed for labor by an ancient race, then the concept of the soul must be rewritten. The church teaches that the soul is a gift from a loving creator, a spark of the infinite. But if we are a biological experiment, the narrative of the soul becomes a narrative of the laboratory. This would dismantle the entire system of sin and salvation. Why would we need to be saved from a nature that was programmed into us by our creators? The threat of hell loses its sting if our flaws are just design errors in an ancient code. The throne's eclipse is also a matter of chronology. The Bible offers a timeline that is relatively short, a few thousand years of human drama. This makes the church feel like it has been there since the beginning. But the Anunnaki timeline stretches back hundreds of thousands of years. It speaks of ages before the flood and kings who ruled for millennia. This vast stretch of time makes the history of the church look like a single day in a very long year. It reduces the Vatican to a footnote in a much larger story. For an institution that claims to be the eternal representative of God, being a footnote is a death sentence. To survive, the church must maintain the illusion that there was nothing before it. It must keep the desert sands over the tablets of Nineveh. But the sands are shifting. Modern science and archaeology are digging up what the church tried to bury. We are finding that the giants of the Bible, the Nephilim, were not just myths, but perhaps the hybrid children of these ancient visitors. We are finding that the technology described in ancient texts, the chariots of fire and the pillars of cloud, sounds more like machines and manifestations of spirit. Every discovery is a new shadow falling across the Vatican. The Church's power is based on the interpretation of the unknown. As the unknown becomes known, the power of the interpreter fades. The priest is replaced by the researcher. The sermon is replaced by the data. This is why the truth is the ultimate enemy. It is not that the truth is evil. It is that the truth is independent. The Vatican has spent centuries trying to harmonize these contradictions. They have used philosophy and theology to explain away the similarities between the Bible and Sumer. They call them prefigurations or cultural echoes. They say that God prepared the ancient world for the truth of the Bible. But this is a desperate defense. It is like saying the rough draft was only written to make the final version look better. The reality is that the clay tablets are more detailed, more grounded, and far older. They carry a weight of authenticity that the edited scrolls of the Bible cannot match. The clay remembers the names of the engineers. The Bible only remembers the name of the king they left behind. As we look deeper into the eclipse, we see that the fear is also political. The Vatican is not just a church. It is a state. It is a system of law and hierarchy. This hierarchy is built on the idea of a top-down command from a singular God. But the Anunnaki were a council. There were many voices, many opinions, and often in conflict. This pluralistic view of the divine is a threat to the centralized power of Rome. If heaven is a council, then the earth does not need a single monarch in a white robe. The structure of the church mimics the structure of a monotheistic heaven. If the heaven of the Anunnaki is a true origin, the earthly mirror must be broken. The church cannot survive the truth, because the truth demands a different kind of humanity. The Bible tells us we are fallen, that we are born in sin, and must spend our lives seeking a forgiveness we do not deserve. The Anunnaki story tells us we are a miracle of ancient science, a bridge between the earth and the stars. It tells us that our curiosity and our flaws are part of our design, not a curse from a vengeful father. This shift from a narrative of guilt to a narrative of origin is the most dangerous thing of all. A person who is guilty is easy to control. A person who is curious about their stars is not. The throne's eclipse is inevitable. You can hide the tablets in the basement of a museum, and you can lock the scrolls in the vaults of a secret archive, but you cannot stop the rising of the sun. The memory of the Anunnaki is built into our very DNA. It is in our obsession with the stars, our drive to build monuments, and our deep ancestral fear of the waters. We are waking up to a history that is older than the church and larger than the Bible. The Vatican feared the Anunnaki because they knew that once we looked at the clay, we would never see the throne the same way again. As the shadow of the eclipse passes, we are left with a choice. We can cling to the edited song of the Bible, or we can listen to the original melody written in the clay. One offers the comfort of a familiar story. The other offers a challenge of a forgotten truth. The church may not survive the eclipse, but humanity will. We will emerge from the shadow with a clearer vision of who we are and where we came from. We will realize that we do not need a gatekeeper to tell us our own history. The clay is speaking. The echoes are turning into voices. And the throne is fading into the light of a much older day. If this journey into the eclipse of the throne has moved you, I invite you to share this story. Let the echoes reach others who are looking for the truth beneath the silence. By sharing, you help turn the whispers into a chorus. Together, we are uncovering the world before the Bible, the world of the Anunnaki. The truth does not need a throne. It only needs to be remembered. And as we remember, the eclipse ends. The light of the ancient past returns, and we see ourselves not as subjects of a church, but as children of the cosmos. The Anunnaki are not coming back from the sky. They are coming back from our memory. And that is the one thing the Vatican could never stop. Good night, and may the truth of the clay find you in the quiet of the stars.